Thank you for having me here today. I hope you find today's talk interesting. Where should we begin? Renewable energy is, whether you are a keen supporter of renewable energy or whether you're maybe agnostic or have other views about it, it does present a problem in liberalized markets as we have in most of Europe and the UK, right? And that's what I'll be addressing. And it's quite unique problem, which has even been exacerbated with the latest financial crises, courtesy of the war in Ukraine. So, I'll begin with the challenges around renewable energy. I hope I'm still on camera here. Anyway, in liberalized markets, electricity generated by solar and PV and wind turbines because of high cost on a levelized basis. And what does that mean? Let me define things first. To look at the cost of energy, you'll hear in the news all the time, renewable energy is cheap as chips and it's never been cheaper and we should go for it, right? It's somewhat disingenuous what they're presenting. They're looking at the price of installed megawatt. What you really should be looking at is the price of megawatt divided by the number of hours you're getting. And there's the problem. But renewable energy doesn't get a lot of hours. Compared to, you can read, in our latitude, solar PV, it only generates about a quarter of the time. So although it might be comparable to gas turbines, although it is a bit more on an installed megawatt basis, when you divide by the number of hours, 1/4 of the hours per year, it means you get a lot less. I don't need to tell anybody in the UK that we have cloudy weather sometimes. With regard to wind, with regard to, again, all those comparisons, with regard to wind, onshore wind, again, it's gotten a lot cheaper, but it's about a quarter of the time. It's about I should jump back. For solar irradiation, it's about 18% of the time at our latitude. For onshore wind, it's about a quarter of the time, and for offshore wind, it's about a third of the time. So that means, again, even if the price per installed megawatt has fallen greatly, divide by the number of hours to get the levelized cost of energy, the price per megawatt hour is actually quite expensive. And that's what needs to be considered. And because it's quite expensive, it creates problems for us. That it means that because you have less hours, and the question is, okay, if I'm an investor, how am I going to get a decent return? If I'm only generating a third of the time for offshore wind, or a quarter of the time for onshore wind, or 18% of the time for solar, how is it justified? Especially, for example, like solar fields, they only last for 20 years. A normal power station lasts for 40, even 50 years, right? So it presents a problem. How do you get people to invest in things that, frankly, you don't get used very often? It would be a bit like, you're going to invest in a coffee shop, but you can only be open one day a week. All right. Rewarding. So it creates a problem, and so one is you don't get enough hours to justify the investment without subsidies. So they want subsidies. In addition, because renewable energy is when the wind blows and when the sun shines, which is obviously intermittent and random. Those two problems mean that you have to give renewable energy what we call dispatch priority, which means that whenever it does happen to be sunny, and I do get off my sunglasses, then the fossil fuel plants, which are dispatchable and can be controlled like a jet engine, they have to be shut down and have to reduce their load. So that imposes enormous cost upon everybody else. So you have the subsidy cost of giving enough hours to subsidy cost to remedy the few number of hours people are generating, and then you have the intermittency cost imposed upon fossil fuel plants. Intermittency cost means that somebody who would have invested in a fossil fuel plant would have expected a gas turbine, like a jet engine, you expect to run it 95% of the time. But if you only have a supporting role, a bit like a sort of actor on the West End, understudy on a West End stage, right? If you only have a supporting role, then you might only be getting 40% of the hours that you could be getting. So now you're creating another problem. You're creating a not insufficient return for people who own fossil fuel plants, such as, some companies like RWE, whom I worked for, they actually pulled out of the UK because their fossil fuel plants or gas turbines simply weren't getting enough hours to justify being in this market. Okay, so that's the sort of problem we have. This research is based on an article that came out when did it come out? 2020, I think it was. Yeah, that's right. It appeared in the journal Energy Policy, where I'm also an editor, not at the time, but afterwards. So supporting RE, as I just mentioned, requires incentives, price premiums, as well as tax credits and other allowances. I mentioned dispatch priority already, which creates balancing costs for everybody else, because National Grid in the UK and all the other grid operators across Europe have to get very, very clever with managing this intermittent output. And what's funny about renewable energy is that I've listened to quite a few presentations by really sort of pure statisticians. It's very hard to predict. It isn't normally distributed. 2 years ago, Germany was like 30-40% less windy that year. Very strange, right? It doesn't obey a normal distribution. It's not a chi-square. It's not a beta. It's very hard. It makes it very hard to predict. In some markets like the UK, to keep fossil fuel plants backing up as backups in that supporting role, they receive what's called capacity payments. Basically, we know you don't get many hours, but we'll pay you to be around. So again, these impose more cost upon the system. The price of electricity comprises both fixed and variable cost. Although renewable energy, and this is where the problem arises, renewable energy is almost entirely a fixed cost system. After all, the fuel is free. When the wind blows, the sun shines, it's free. So it's literally all fixed cost. The fixed and variable cost components of electricity vary greatly across the EU, and how these costs are met have distributional effects, which is the focus of my research. So if you look at the additional cost of renewable energy, the support for investors in renewable energy, those special prices, the additional cost in supporting keeping fossil fuel plants online, plus all the costs of National Grid and other grid operators to balance all that energy that just jumps into the system and then jumps out of the system. If this were small, it wouldn't be a big bother, but it's actually very large, and the plans are, of course, for most governments across the UK and the EU is to make it even bigger. They want to be as green as possible, and that means a lot of costs. So actually, if you look at now, the price of electricity has increased a lot in the last year and a half for reasons that are quite obvious. If you assumed a price as it used to be, around 45 euros a megawatt hour, if you look at the consumption by different sectors and look at the green contribution and look at the cost of renewable energy, again, the levelized cost of energy, so you take that fixed cost and divide it by the number of hours you're actually getting, what it means is that What it means is that you're spending a lot extra money. So industry is spending 19 billion more. Transport is spending 1.2 billion more across the UK, Europe, and households 32 billion more, and in total 53 billion. This data was as of 2016. I computed in 17 initially. Anyway, just a few years ago, courtesy of the additional support, so again, the three sources, we have the subsidies to renewable energy because you don't get any hours for those investors, the grid managing costs, and the capacity payments to fossil fuel plants to support renewable energy. The UK, across the whole continent, we were spending 53 billion more. That's a lot of money. And so the question is, who pays for it and how is it paid for? Although EU feed-in tariffs have been reduced for new RE investments, various governments have tried to apply the subsidies to renewable energy retrospectively without much luck. And people who support renewable energy They're usually they're quite well connected. You have organizations like the Quango, the Climate Change Committee. Many of these people sit on to be frankly also, many people sit on the boards of energy companies, renewable energy investors, and the efforts to reduce the subsidies to renewable energy have been very, very challenging. To the extent now, we've seen transport, we've seen industry, we've seen consumers and households, right? To the extent that industry, business, and transport do not absorb the cost of supporting RE, an additional $28 billion in cost on top of the $45 billion is already faced by retail consumers. So in many countries like Germany, for example, is a good example. The German government makes up to the German industry the additional cost of renewable energy. And obviously, nothing's free, so somebody else has to pay for it. And ultimately, of course, it's the taxpayer. The magnitude of support varies across EU. It raised the question of whether retail consumers, households within a given country are treated equitably. So we've seen, the thread of my argument then is that we have a lot of extra cost. We've seen the costs are being imposed upon households, not upon industry and transport because you want to stay competitive. So now the question is, given that it's going to fall ultimately, of course, on household, because the incidence costs are, even in competitive markets, all people who studied Econ 101 recall, even in competitive markets, a tax would fall, would fall on equity, on shareholders, consumers, and wage earners, in sort of public finance 101, right? Here, most of the cost is actually being ultimately falling upon consumers. So you have a question then is, okay, now that we recognize how much money is being hitting the pockets of consumers across Europe, you have the question is that amount allocated fairly? And the research shows that it's not. There's all kinds of consumers. There's people who live in, huge homes in Richmond, and there's people who live in very modest homes in somewhere in modest flats in Brixton. All right. So if we look at break it down, then look at the components of electricity costs, and these were 2016. It's actually gone it's a bit more egregious now, actually. So actually, people you've seen in the last year, and I was on the BBC a few times talking about the energy cost bill, and people saying, asking me how the war in Ukraine is hitting the price of energy, and I have to always remind my interviewer that that's only about a third of the bill. In addition to that, you have network costs, you have environmental costs. So together these things are over 40%. That's actually more than the actual wholesale cost of energy. So that's hitting it a lot. You have some other direct costs. You have those costs are significant, and the wholesale cost of energy, which is driven by the price of natural gas, which is the marginal fuel for producing energy. That's as I said, that's about a third roughly. Okay. So now if you look at if you look at retail prices across the European Union, and then it's also, the data is actually very interesting. Although we have an integrated, although there are grid connections across Europe, although supply generally tries to flow to price, and that you don't have huge disequilibrium between different markets, you still see huge prices in what retail consumers pay. And if you just look at a sort of aggregate level here, we see that, and actually it's quite extraordinary, really. So if you look at retail electricity prices, including network charges, and I'm looking at this sort of modest house, the sort of small to average household, which consumes between 2,500 and roughly 5,000 kilowatt hours a year. And those breakdowns are from the Eurostat data. And what's interesting, it's even though, so you have a fairly integrated market. At the wholesale level, you have connections between Germany, France and Spain, so Italy and France, and so on and so forth. Right? You still see quite large differences in electricity between places. Right? In Belgium, it's at the time, it was at 30 euro cents per kilowatt hour. Germany, it was very high. Luxembourg is a bit lower, but you can see it's, and if it's the same market, at the retail level, it's definitely not the same market. If you look at household electricity prices, then if you look at the excluding tax and levies, so we'll just exclude tax and levies first, that we see a wide difference across the EU in what's being paid. We see large difference in the table shown below anyway. So it's just breaking the data down a bit further, and it shows a huge difference, 92%. That's the difference between here and here, okay? And if you include tax and levies, it's even larger, it's 119%, which reflects this greater burden being put upon retail consumers, courtesy of renewable energy. If you look at consumption, so we're looking at these are the different categories I'm looking at, and I said this category here, roughly, this is sort of between these two categories here, are the bulk of most households, right? We're talking about somebody who's not, if you're living in Richmond and have a swimming pool, you're probably not worried about electricity prices, and you're probably way up here, okay, keeping the pool warm. So what's funny about renewable energy, and I said earlier, is that it's a fixed cost system, okay? The fuel component was no fuel, it's just whenever the sun shines, so it's largely fixed cost. So what happens with renewable energy is that you wind up spreading the fixed cost over the number of units. So what do we see? People who take a lot of energy wind up paying a lot less. It's almost funny. It would be like if you went to buy petrol, and the price you paid was based upon the value of your car. So if you driving with a Bentley, well, it's quite cheap. If you're driving with a 12-year-old Nissan, you pay a lot. And so it's a very curious system. So we see huge differences. The more one takes across the EU, and we have here the different categories. So the ones I just showed you earlier, these are the colors here, okay? And the blue line shows the smallest consumers, and what do we see across many countries across Europe? Belgium, the Czech Republic, Germany, Spain. Any place you have a blue line that's really high means the price per kilowatt hour being paid by the smallest consumers is a lot. It's a huge difference, which is why it's so regressive. There are exceptions. Denmark is actually quite flat. People pay the same. Germany said is higher. Spain, any small consumer in Spain is getting quite a poor deal. Malta is almost hard to explain, because it looks like people in the middle it's pretty similar, but the smallest and the richest get hit. UK, here we are over here, and you can see UK is definitely a regressive system. So what people are paying at the smallest households, maybe 2,000 kilowatt hours a year, that's somebody living in a north-facing apartment. They don't own the place. They probably have poor cavity insulation. They might probably have electric heating as well, to make matters worse. Not gas heating, which is cheaper, and they're paying more than the person living in that nice home in Richmond or Holland Park somewhere with the 7 bedrooms. Okay, so across the European Union and the UK, you see a regressive system in how electricity is priced. Okay, any questions? All right, this working? Let's see. Good. Okay. Network charges again. So that's prices by consumers. Now I'll throw network charges as well. Again, you see a regressive picture there. The smaller you are, the more you're getting hit with a fixed cost, which is adding up to your total energy bill on your per kilowatt hour. So again, network charges are quite egregious in some places. I mean, again, let's say that Austria is quite egregious. Hungary is quite flat. Luxembourg is quite regressive. Germany is again regressive. So some countries, Sweden and I have to say we're okay. Iceland, Norway, Sweden. You see these big blue lines there, and then it's going like that. quite regressive on network charges. Who's paying for it? People in the small homes, usually flats, and they're getting hit with all the network charges. Hardly fair. And then lastly, we have taxes, fees, and levies, and it's very much the same picture. Who's paying for it? It's the people in the smallest homes, north-facing flats, apartments, rented accommodation, who are being hit with most of the taxes and levies for renewable energy. Not a very fair picture, really. If you see changes over time, average expenditure by components, smallest to largest, and you see that, so we got energy cost, network cost, and tax and levies, and here we're looking at the smallest consumers, and here we're looking at largest consumers, all right? For the largest consumers, the gradient is less steep. For the small consumers, the gradient the levels are higher, and also you see a steeper gradient. From the years of 2018, and now we're roughly in the UK at about 13% of our energy actual production is coming out of renewable energy. I wouldn't want to think what these graphs might be if we went up to 20-30%, like the 2030 plans for greening our economy. Right, tax and levies by category. There's just some selective stuff as well. And again, it's the same picture. Smallest households, really small, under 1,000 kilowatt hours. These people, and you see the same sort of picture. Generally, you're paying more tax and levies per unit of kilowatt hour. The smaller you are as a customer. Regressive price across the EU. This is just another way of looking at it. Absolute difference between total electricity price for smallest versus largest consumers. And you see, again, this is just absolute difference between prices. And we see for most of the, Malta, again, is a funny exception. But most of the, what the smallest consumers pay versus what the largest consumers pay, we see a large absolute difference. EU-wide regressive stats. Anyway, this is done on a percentage basis, like the numbers earlier, okay? So we have energy costs, maximum, minimum, and this is just looking at the data a different way. But it is the same story, okay? I'm happy to take questions on any of the data here. What else here? Expenditure, energy costs, plus network costs, plus taxes, EU average, small versus largest. So here's the smallest consumers, and there's the largest consumers. So there's people, roughly around 2,000 kilowatt hours a year, and there's people over 10,000 kilowatt hours a year. Again, a regressive picture. Bigger homes, bigger consumption, and bigger income. So if we reasonably assume that somebody who lives in Holland Park has a lot more money than somebody living in somewhere else, then we can, and if we're willing to say that the size of the home is a good indicator of wealth or income, then we see the average house. So if you look at the size of dwellings as a proxy for income, which is not unreasonable. The larger one home, the greater one's income. For the UK, the average household consumes 71 kilowatt hours per square meter. Smaller homes tend to use electricity for space heating and less cavity, as already mentioned. In Europe, it's 79%. Anyway, in Germany, there's some heat pumps. Anyway, it shows these support our data as well. And so, all right. So I've presented a problem now, and with that we have renewable energy. It doesn't pay for itself. It requires subsidies, imposes cost upon the economy. So the question then, as an economist, ask, well, how can the question be addressed, right? And of course, ultimately cost cannot exceed revenues for any system. So if you look at this picture here, as a natural monopoly, and electricity is a natural monopoly, the larger the facility, the less price per, the cost per generation falls, and also you get network advantage and all this other thing, right? There's a reason why cities and towns used to have their own little thermal central, and now we have large plants out of town which get portfolio advantages as well, rather than serving as one little place where they would have to have overcapacity. You serve many cities, and you address that problem. To cover the loss of it, so as a natural monopoly, to correct the inefficiency of a natural monopolist, pricing may be set through regulation at marginal cost, making customer expenditure a linear function of price. To cover a loss, a two-part nonlinear tariff consisting of a fixed amount or a fee and varying consumption. So the one way of addressing this problem might be to get rid of, if you're going to have renewable energy, don't charge per unit. Why? Because it's inevitable that that the more you take, the better deal you get. To this approach to pricing addresses the shortfall, but raises the question of how the fixed portion should be shared. To cover the loss shown in the figure, the loss over N there, where N is the number of customers could be charged. Under this approach, all customers, regardless of consumption, pay an equal portion of fixed costs. This would be more fair than the current arrangement, where effectively the large consumers pay the least fixed cost per unit of electricity consumed. Although EU electricity markets are deregulated and privatized, the technology of already almost entirely driven by fixed cost, supported by, creates the problem of how such cost sharing should take place. Oh, sorry, go back. Let's see, back. Okay, this is the same picture, or this. I refer to this lately because it just also shows how difficult it is to integrate renewable energy into our current system. We all have seen in the last year, courtesy of the war in Ukraine, that the price of natural gas has risen enormously, okay? We've seen prices now we haven't even, anybody in any business we know couldn't have dreamt of. What that is, but you have a system where the marginal cost of fuel, natural gas, sets the price, okay? Because they're the plant that's at the margin, dispatchable, ready to be there when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. This raising the cost of, by increasing the price of natural gas, has increased the cost of energy from traditional dispatchable plants. But that means there's a huge windfall for solar and wind, courtesy of this system. So it's just showing how the point we've already outlined the key problems around renewable energy, that it leads to regressiveness. But you can also say that that renewable energy, it's very hard to integrate it with a system where the marginal price is set by fossil fuels, and especially when we have, major situations like we've had in the last year. Okay. I've also ran some correlations between small versus large consumers, and this basically is just showing regressive in prices. So what these data shows is that basically the more renewable energy you have, the more aggressive you are. Okay, we saw it in the graphs anyway, but the data supports it. Some countries are the correlations are very high. In Finland, Austria, the more renewables they have, the more aggressive their pricing structure. It varies. In the UK, we're about 67%. Slovakia is 30%, but it varies. But these are presence of renewable energy and how aggressive your pricing structure winds up being. And explanations then, some of these we've already mentioned. Of course, correlation doesn't prove causation. Whether a household takes 2,000 or 10,000 is material from a cost perspective. Regressive pricing to recover fixed costs is appealing. So actually, I'm trying to explain this. I said correlation doesn't prove anything. It's actually the incentive of energy companies to have a nice, to have most of the return based upon a fixed cost tariff. They like that. Why? Because it's predictable. When I worked for RWB, we had some horrible consumers up in the Northeast. Nice people, I'm sure, but when they went to the pub, to shut the heat off. We'd get these huge spikes in demand, right? People in the smallest homes, they'd go out for 2 hours and the heat went off, right? We'd have consumers like that. If you can have a fixed cost system, nice predictable revenues, it's great for the energy companies. They love it. It makes their returns more predictable. The cost of capital therefore goes down, and therefore the capitalized value of the returns goes up. Okay. This is also the other study in California was done. This was the Berkeley Institute, at the Haas Institute at Berkeley. Anyway, basically, it's a lower middle income households bear the great burden. These households are increasingly responsible for covering the high fixed costs of total consumption from the grid, from the grid due to large increasing. So if you're living in a big home, again, a rooftop solar, you're being subsidized. You're living in a flat again. It's the same. But so the story we see in Europe is actually not unique. It's any place where they're encouraging renewable energy. Arguably, a more equitable model, getting back to my graphs earlier, would be recover costs from sales or income taxes or an income-based approach, fixed charge. And the report suggests that how to fix cost, changes to how utility fixed costs are spread anyway. Okay? Solutions in many U.S. states, for example, they're actually implementing mechanisms now to decouple revenues from commodity sales to promote efficiency and conservation. Although renewable energy has variable costs of zero, they're introducing different pricing schemes. And maybe really the right way to approach renewable energy is that you should be charging, for not renewable energy in general, but the way we charge for electricity should be based on really an option, the right to take electricity. Somebody who has a huge home in Holland Park, they should be charged, we all know they're going to take more, they should be charged the optionality, the right to take more. I know somebody in a one-bedroom flat won't be interested in a right to take 10,000 kilowatt hours. It would be very improbable. Okay, there's some more data. Okay, so that's basically summarizes my points. The key points here is that putting a greater burden of fixed costs upon the largest consumers, and also perhaps through a lump sum tax might be justified, or on equality of loss to marginal utility. So basic, sort of classic economics here, or willingness to pay, ability to pay principles. And also we've seen the problem exacerbated by the steep merit order, which has been made worse under the recent crisis in Ukraine. Anyway, that sort of wraps up my talk, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much.